Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Recently, the topic of starlight and time came up in some conversations, and it's interesting that a number of Christians have looked at all sorts of theories to explain the issue of if God created the world and the universe only 6,000 years ago, how can we see stars that are billions of light years away and even millions of light years away? Because essentially what they're saying, what we know is that the universe is so large that the light from these stars that we're seeing would take millions, and some of them billions of years to get here, travelling at the speed of light. And I thought it's really interesting to have a look at this. I've talked about it before. One of the important issues that many people don't realise is that it's quite within the laws of physics for light to travel instantaneously. Now, sometimes I think people would say, oh, no, hang on. You're not talking about some other theory like a flat earth theory or this sort of thing. Okay, so with flat earth theory, we know we can, just fly in an aeroplane. You can look out the window and you can see the curvature of the earth, and you can see that it curves in, whether you're flying north, south, east, west, it's got curvature, and we can send satellites up and take pictures and so forth. So we know quite clearly that flat earth theory is ridiculous. And it just doesn't even make scientific sense. But instantaneous light travel does make sense in terms of physics. And some leading physicists have pointed this out and how important this could be. And that's what I'd like to talk about and discuss a little bit deeper today. But one of the things that I thought it'd be good to do first off is just refresh what the Bible actually says about this. Now, if we go to the book of Genesis in the Bible, the first book of the Bible, we read there the very first verse of the Bible is, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And this establishes the God that we worship, the God who is our Saviour, the God who loves us. He's the God who created everything. And if this God is so powerful that he can create everything, and he wants a relationship with us, which the Bible goes on to explain. And God, who manifested himself as Jesus and came and lived among us to show us what he was like, clearly explained that God is a God of love. And we know as we look around us and we look at our environment, there's so much beauty and so forth. Now, a lot of documentaries, and particularly evolutionary type documentaries, can focus on this survival of the fittest aspect and pain and suffering and these things. But of course the Bible explains that too, that wasn't the original plan. This is a result of sin, of disobedience. And also it's logical when we look into it, that generally we have laws to protect us and make things safe for everybody. And we know the consequences of disobeying those laws usually results in someone getting hurt and pain. And it was the same back then in Eden. God set up a perfect system, but when people go outside the system, and of course Satan, some of the angels went outside the system, began telling lies, and we have all the consequences that followed from that. But if we look then at what the Bible goes on to say, we see in the beginning of Genesis here that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then it goes on to set up what happened. And we read that in the beginning the earth was without form and void, and there was darkness, and then the Spirit of God began moving over the face of the waters. And so we begin to have creation unfolding before us because God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. We then go on, as we go down through the different days where the space or firmament was made on the second day, and then the land surfaces and earth and our planet was formed with the oceans and the land surfaces on day 3, and the vegetation appeared on day 3. And then on day 4, we read, "And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens, to separate the day from the night. Let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth and to rule over the day, and so forth. So we also then go on and read in Genesis chapter 2, verse 1, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them." And so this was after the 6th day, and verse 2 goes on to say, "And on the 7th day God rested." So it seems quite clear that the Bible is saying very clearly that the stars, the sun, the moon, were all set up on day 4. The space-time system was set up on day 4. Now, there are other passages that relate to this as well. If we have a look, for example, in Psalm 33, we read in verse 6, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all their hosts by the breath of his mouth." And essentially what that's telling us is that God spoke the stars into existence, spoke everything into existence. In other words, and I sort of imagine this, God thought about it and said, "Let it be." And that's exactly what I said. Let there be light, let there be the stars. And what was in his mind, we have to use earthly terms to describe God. He's totally outside our physical construct. He's outside our universe. He is self-existent. He always was. He's outside time and space. But obviously his thoughts can materialise. And I've talked about this before, how our thoughts, which are non-material, can affect electrical voltages, and we can make things. So our thoughts can do that. So God's thoughts surely can make things, cause things to appear, create systems that make things, create energy, create matter. And that's exactly what it says. So we have a miraculous creation of the universe. Now that fits a lot of data, as I've talked about in the past. We have all this evidence that the universe is young. We have this evidence the solar system is young. Now, Isaiah goes on, and Isaiah talks about the same sort of thing, and he records his experience with God. And thus says the Lord, God speaking to Isaiah, "I made the earth and created man upon it. It was my hands that stretched out the heavens, and I commanded all their host." That's Isaiah 45, verse 12. And so quite through the Bible we see that the heavens were created by a miraculous process. It wasn't some sort of Big Bang type scenario where, laws of physics created things. God just spoke things into existence. Now this makes a lot of sense, right? Because we know that, at the present time, there's no known laws of physics that can explain how the universe could form itself, how the gases that might, hydrogen and helium, that might be created by, fusion energy reactions somehow can then solidify and generate the higher elements and so forth, or come together as sufficient density to form planets and stars. There's no known way. And secondly, a lot of these systems are interdependent. Stars, planets and moons and so forth. There's balancing systems there that are parts of their orbit and so forth. There's so much balancing that that takes place. So in other words, you need to create a complete system really for it to work. Otherwise, it's going to fall to bits while you're trying to have it form. And these are one of the reasons why there are no workable theories that fit the data that can explain the origin of our solar system or our universe. Sure, textbooks talk about these things, but when we examine the details, there's major problems. The mechanisms that they propose can't explain the phenomena that we observe. There's another very interesting verse that I think is quite important, and particularly for Christians. And this is in Hebrews chapter 11, and it's verse 3 of Hebrews chapter 11. And it says, "By faith we understand that the world was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was made out of things which do not appear." And this, again, is a very interesting statement, is that by faith we understand this. And it's by faith that we are saved. It's by faith that we please God. And that's how Abraham pleased God. Now, is it blind faith? Is it blind faith to believe that if the stars were created on day 4, only about 6,000 years ago, thereabouts, that we can see them? No. And this is the important point. When they, as I mentioned earlier, when they began measuring the speed of light and so forth, these problems arose. Well, how can we see stars that are so far away? They must be much older. And, of course, the atheist type that wanted to, scientists that wanted to, disprove the Bible, they, really were jumping on this bandwagon. And there was a whole field of thought in this area. But one of the areas of relates to this is that how can we measure something related to time? And this gets into quite a deep discussion. And I mentioned that, Einstein assumed, for example, that the speed of light was the same in all directions. But if you were an observer and you're measuring something going past its speed relative to you changes, and the speed that you're travelling at can affect the speed that you determine the object is travelling at as well. So there's really a whole lot of complications there. But as I said, Einstein, looking at the problem of measuring signals and so forth, simply assumed that the speed of light was the same in all directions, but it doesn't have to be. And this is the whole concept of simultaneity. I mentioned some of the work that was done earlier on by Hans Reichenbach. Now, again, Hans, he was a German philosopher of science. He was educated at the University of Berlin, the University of Göttingen, the University of Munich, the University of Erlangen, where he earned his PhD in 1916. And his PhD was on the concept of probability for the mathematical representation of reality. He was really a brilliant philosopher, Reichenbach. We don't read much of his stuff in English because he wrote in German. But he was certainly a leading philosopher of science and a proponent of logical empiricism. And he did a lot of work in the theory of probability and in the area of philosophy and mathematics, and particularly in space, time and relativity theory and quantum mechanics. And so here we have a very, very serious, deep thinker here. And he challenged Einstein's assumption that the speed of light was uniform in all directions. And he modified and adapted Einstein's equations accordingly to allow for that possibility, depending on what value of a particular constant that one chooses. And as I said, Einstein happened to choose a value of 0.5 or a half, but it actually in simplicity would make much better sense for the constant to be 1. And if it is 1, it eliminates it. You don't need that constant there. And secondly, what that means then is that light coming towards the observer is instantaneous. But the time to measure how long that time takes, that signal, travels at half the speed of light. Very interesting. By the way, Reichenbach moved to the United States in 1938 and he took up a professorship at the University of California, Los Angeles in its philosophy department. And it was Reichenbach who helped establish UCLA as a leading school of philosophy in the United States just after the war. So we're talking about a person here who's no fringe philosopher. He was a brilliant philosopher. As I said, set up the philosophy department and raised the standard of that at the University of California, LA campus, Los Angeles campus. Now, the stuff that he wrote is very heavy, and you can look up his works there. But perhaps one of the best ways to look at it is to read the works of Max Jammer. Now, Max Jammer analyses and breaks down Reichenbach's work in this area. And Max Jammer was another physicist. So Jammer studied physics, philosophy and history of science at the University of Vienna, and then at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he received his PhD in experimental physics in 1942. And he served in the British Army during the war, and then in 1952 moved to Harvard University and worked and became quite a close colleague of Albert Einstein, who was at Princeton University. And so here we have Max Jammer. He taught at Harvard, University of Oklahoma, Boston University, before establishing the department and becoming a professor of physics at the Bar Ilan University in Israel, which is one of the leading universities in Israel. And, of course, he's been a visiting professor at a whole lot of universities, including Columbia University. Now, Max Jammer writes in this area, and the book that he deals with this whole issue that you can have instantaneous light travel, doesn't violate the laws of physics, is a book called Concepts of Simultaneity, From Antiquity to Einstein and Beyond. It was published by Johns Hopkins University Press. So I'll just say that title again. So the name is Max Jammer, Jammer, and it's Concepts of Simultaneity, From Antiquity to Einstein and Beyond, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Now, Max Jammer has written some other really interesting stuff related to this on space and time, a lot of very interesting areas that relate to our understanding of physics and how science works. And the whole thing is that when we look at this big picture, we find that the Bible's description of how things happen and that God spoke the universe into existence in a very short time, it happened like that, just fits so well. And secondly, as I said previously, if God stated that created the stars, and we were created specially, He created this universe special for us. We're very special in this universe because God personally came here to save us. Then it doesn't make sense to create all these stars that we wouldn't see. We wouldn't have seen them. We wouldn't start of seeing for years. So this creates it supplies the answer to a very interesting problem. But I think people that have doubts on this, that this is reasonable, have a look at the actual writings on these by these great philosophers and physicists like Max Jammer and Hans Reichenbach. For those who prefer a more modern, more recent treatment of it, there's a book called The Physics of Einstein. It's published by a Biblical Science Institute, so a small publishing company, but it's by a physicist by the name of Jason Lisle, Lisle is his name. Jason Lisle, Lisle. And it's called The Physics of Einstein. And so that again, explains all this concept how if we have an anisotropic system, then we have instantaneous light travel. And he goes on to explain, he talks about the work done back in the 1970s by John A. Winnie, who was another philosopher at the time at the University of Hawaii. John A. Winnie, he published a very interesting article on and pointed out that special relativity depends on the round-trip speed, not the one-way speed of light. So in other words, all our calculations depend on this there and back speed of light. And, one of the interesting, things that he points out is that to assume that the one-way speed of light is the same is, an assumption that can't be proven and in actual fact has some problems. For those who are interested in reading that up to, as I said, the author is John A. Winnie, Winnie, spelled just as in Winnie the Pooh, I guess. It was published in the Philosophy of Science, the Journal of Philosophy of Science in 1970. It's volume 37, issue 1, pages 81 to 99. So here we have some really good science here, and it fits our faith. We are not way out as Christians to believe that on day 4 we could see all the stars, and yet all the stars were created at that time. And I think this is very important to realise and understand that. And the other thing, as I mentioned before too, as we've talked about this previously, is that the one-way speed of light can't be measured. We can't measure that. We can only measure the average speed of light. And so this, and as, it's pointed out, special relativity, all these other theories use the average speed of light, not the one-way speed of light, which is what is important for us to be able to see the stars. Just a couple of days ago, I received an email from a medical professor friend who announced he'd just retired, and he spoke to me about he finds the evidence for design in nature so compelling that there is a designer, that there is a creator. And I thought it was interesting because I'd recently just read in a news release by the BBC in England, British Broadcasting Commission. This was released on the 5th of September 2019. And the headline reads, "Scientists want creationism teaching ban in Welsh schools." In other words, these scientists want to ban creationism teaching in Welsh schools. And the headline was that Sir David Attenborough has intervened and called for a ban on teaching pseudoscience in schools. So here we see that we have people like, Sir David Attenborough, and he's produced some marvellous and amazing documentaries and is highly respected, but calling belief in creation a pseudoscience. Now, I've just been talking about this concept of instantaneous light travel, and I dare say, some people would put that into pseudoscience. And yet when we look at the physicists that are looking at this and exploring this, and what they're pointing out is, hang on, Einstein wasn't right in everything. Einstein made assumptions, and some of his assumptions aren't necessarily correct, and they're not necessarily based on good data or good observations. And but it's really interesting too that these people are really concerned about teaching creationism. What the article went on to say was the teaching of creationism could creep into schools under Wales' new curriculum, scientists have said, and a letter signed by 46 individuals and organisations, including Sir David Attenborough, asked the Welsh Government to explicitly ban the teaching of creationism as science. And I personally think that should ring alarm bells. Why would you want to ban that when at the present time there's no known explanation for how evolutionary mechanism can produce new code, can produce a new body part. There's no known explanation for how the universe could form, or even our solar system could form, and yet they want to ban the teaching of creation. And I think one of the reasons is that these scientists, and some of the other scientists include Richard Dawkins, another person, Steve Jones, and I think he might be a chemist, Steve Jones, and Alice Roberts, warned that changes could increase in the new curriculum could increase the possibility of teaching creationism of science. And they go on to point out the new science and technology area of learning, this in Wales doesn't explicitly prohibit presenting creationism and other pseudo-scientific theories as evidence-based. And evolution is only mentioned once, the letter said. It's interesting that these scientists are so concerned. They don't want creationism taught, and yet we have this overwhelming evidence and growing evidence that the universe and the earth and life on earth must have been created. There's no mechanical way that it could form. You know, as I read this, I thought about the Aberfan mine disaster that occurred in Wales, and that was when this big slag heap from a mine suddenly slid down a mountain, I think it was after heavy rain, and just buried this school, and a whole lot of school children were died. And I died, and that was a horrendous tragedy, taking these young lives. You know, I did some research some years ago in this, and it was interesting. The people in that village were mostly Christians. They were quite strong believers. And it's interesting the number of children that said to their parents, came home and said to their parents at different times just before, "Don't worry, Mummy, I'm going to be all right. I will be with Jesus." And it's almost as if these children had premonitions that something was going to happen and that they would be taken, but they had such strong faith that they were right with God. And that's very interesting, because how could they have that premonition? How could they know? Why did they say those things? We have so much evidence that there is a real intervening God. Bad things happen in our world, like that tragedy. But without God, there's no hope for anyone. Those parents have hope that one day, the second coming of Jesus, they're going to see their children again. Evolution doesn't offer that hope. Remember, you can catch up on this program by Googling 3ABN Australia, or one word, 3abnaustralia.org.au. And when the page opens up, click on the listen, and then a number of different programs will come up, including Faith and Science. And you can go back and get details, perhaps, of any of the books that I've read. You've been listening to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Have a great day.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.